Have you ever thought about, like, how climate change could impact something like how we get wood to build a house?
It's not something most people think about every day, but it's a really important question a lot of folks in the forest products industry are dealing with right now, especially in the Northeast.
And that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today on the FBS podcast. You know, as mid-career professionals, I think it's really important for us to understand these kinds of big shifts, even if we don't work in forestry.
Hmm.
You know, seeing how one industry adapts can really help us think differently and spark new ideas for our own careers, no matter where we are in our journey.
Yeah, that's a great point. These ripple effects are everywhere, and today we're really focusing on how climate change is impacting the forest products supply chain in the Northeast, from the forests themselves all the way to the lumber mills and everything in between.
Okay, so let's unpack this. What are some of the most dramatic climate changes happening in the Northeast that are impacting forestry?
Well, one of the biggest changes has been the warming trend, especially in the winter. In fact, December and January, temperatures have gone up by an average of over 4 degrees since the 1980s.
Wow.
Yeah, and that might not seem like a lot, but when you think about it, that has a huge impact on things like frozen ground, which is really important for logging.
I can see how that would really make things difficult.
Yeah.
What about rainfall? Has that changed much?
It has. We're seeing a lot more rain, especially in October. And since it's getting colder and the days are shorter, that water isn't evaporating as quickly. So it's creating what some people are calling a fall mud season. It makes it much harder to even get into the forest to harvest timber.
So warmer winters and wetter autumns. That's a tough combination for an industry that needs predictable seasons. How are people adapting to these changes?
It's forcing everyone to get creative. One thing is that the old way of thinking about summer and winter harvests is gone. Landowners are now thinking about 4 distinct seasons and figuring out the best time to harvest for each stand of trees.
That sounds like a much more complex way to manage the land.
It is, and it's changing the contracts between landowners and logging companies. Contracts are getting longer now, which allows for more flexibility to deal with the weather.
So it's all about managing uncertainty.
Exactly, and it means loggers have to adapt based on the conditions, on the ground.
This is probably increasing communication and collaboration in the industry, right?
Absolutely. Foresters and loggers are working together more than ever now. It's almost like co-managing the land, figuring out the best places to harvest and the best times to do it.
Trying to keep that balance.
Yeah, they're trying to be as efficient as possible while minimizing the environmental impact.
Which brings us to best management practices, or BMPs. I know they're crucial for protecting water quality and that the Northeast has been a leader in using them. Can you explain a bit more about how they work and what kind of impact they're having?
Sure, BMPs are basically a set of guidelines and practices designed to minimize the impact of forestry on the environment, especially on water quality. And in the Northeast, there's been a big push to adopt voluntary BMPs.
And how has that been going?
Compliance has actually been pretty high.
That's great to hear.
Yeah.
But I imagine there's a cost to all of this, right?
Yeah, there is. Implementing BMPs often means loggers need to invest in special equipment like portable bridges, culverts, and mats to control erosion. And then there's the cost of lost work days when the weather makes it impossible to work safely or without harming the environment.
So you have the cost of the equipment and the potential for lost income.
Exactly. And these hidden costs can be significant. There's a growing awareness that some of these costs, like the ones related to lost productivity, are often uncompensated, which puts a strain on logging businesses.
It's a real balancing act.
It is. Finding that balance between protecting the environment and keeping the industry economically viable. That's the key, especially with the uncertainty of a changing climate.
Let's dig a little deeper into the impact on logging operations.
Hmm.
Are there specific equipment changes or adjustments to techniques that are being made because of climate change?
Oh, definitely. One of the biggest shifts we're seeing is in the types of harvesting equipment. Whole tree harvesting, where the entire tree is removed, is still common in the Northeast.
Right.
But there's growing interest in cut-to-length systems, especially for operations in sensitive areas.
Can you explain what makes these cut-to-length systems different and why they might be better for wetter conditions?
Sure. So in a cut-to-length system, the trees are processed right there in the forest. They're delimbed, cut to length, and sorted before being taken out of the woods.
Okay.
This is different from whole tree harvesting, where the whole tree is dragged out, which can cause more damage to the soil, especially when it's wet.
I see.
Cut to length often uses forwarders, which have special tires that minimize ground pressure and reduce compaction.
So it's a gentler approach to harvesting, which is especially important in areas that are sensitive to soil compaction or erosion.
Exactly. And as we see more wet weather, it's becoming even more important.
Of course, no matter what equipment you use, BMPs are essential. What are some of the specific BMPs being used to protect water quality during logging?
One of the most important BMPs is the careful planning and layout of logging roads and skid trails. This involves minimizing stream crossings and making sure water can flow naturally across the landscape.
Makes sense.
Another key BMP is using water bars and culverts to divert water away from roads and trails to prevent erosion and sedimentation.
Are there any specific BMPs for protecting wetlands or other sensitive areas?
Absolutely. Wetlands are really important for water quality and wildlife habitat, so there are strict regulations to protect them during logging operations. This might involve using special equipment like low ground pressure skidders or even restricting operations altogether during certain times of the year to avoid disturbing sensitive soils.
So it's all about understanding the specific characteristics of each site and tailoring the approach to minimize impact.
Yeah. Exactly. And that kind of site-specific planning is becoming more and more important as we face the uncertainty of a changing climate.
We've talked about how these unpredictable weather patterns are impacting harvesting. But what about those traditional winter logging skills, like building frozen roads? Are those in decline as reliable winters become less common?
Definitely. And it's not just about losing a specific skill set, it's about losing a kind of knowledge and adaptability that was passed down through generations. It's important to find ways to document these techniques and share that knowledge, even if it's not used as often as it once was.
It's like a cultural knowledge that's at risk of disappearing.
hmm
And with it, a certain understanding of the forest and how to work within its natural rhythms.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It really highlights the need to bridge that knowledge gap between generations. So, we were talking about how loggers are adapting to the changing climate before the break, and it's something we're going to keep looking at as we move to the next step in the supply chain, the mills.
Yeah, exactly. It's one thing to harvest the wood, but getting it to the mills to be processed is a whole other challenge. I'm sure these unpredictable weather patterns and shifting seasons are causing some logistical problems there too.
Absolutely. Mills are really feeling the pressure.
Yeah.
Their entire operation relies on a consistent supply of timber. And with all these disruptions to the harvest schedule, it's a major challenge for them.
It's interesting because the idea of a logging chance used to be about the types of trees on a side or the size of the trees.
Right.
But now it's about so much more than that. It's about the weather, the ground conditions, the regulations,
Yeah.
all these factors that determine whether you can even get the wood out at all.
You're right. The term logging chance has taken on a whole new meaning now with climate change. It really shows how important it is for landowners, loggers, and mills to work together and communicate.
We talked about how loggers are having to change their techniques and find alternatives to traditional frozen roads. Are there any innovations or adaptations happening at the mills to deal with these unpredictable supplies?
Mills are getting really creative with their procurement strategies.
Yeah.
One approach that's becoming more popular is using what's called a spatial menu.
A spatial menu. I've never heard of that. What is it exactly?
Basically, it's a map that shows different sources of wood and when those sources are going to be accessible throughout the year. So, for instance, a mill might have a list of suppliers who are harvesting in wetland areas.
Okay.
And those areas might only be accessible during the winter when the ground is frozen. The spatial menu helps the mill keep track of these different sources and plan their procurement accordingly.
So it's like a dynamic map of the supply chain that takes into account all these factors like weather, ground conditions, and even things like road weight restrictions, which we talked about earlier.
Precisely. It's all about being able to adapt to changing circumstances and making the most of every opportunity.
We touched on how some mills are even going so far as to finance young loggers to guarantee future supply. Could you tell us a little more about that? It sounds like a bold move.
It is, but for some mills, it's a matter of survival. They see that the logging workforce is getting older, and they're worried about not having enough skilled workers in the future. By financing young loggers, they're investing in the next generation and ensuring a steady supply of wood for years to come.
That's thinking ahead. That's not just meeting today's needs. It's planning for the future.
That's right. And it shows that they understand how interconnected the whole supply chain is. Mills are realizing that their success depends on the success of the logging businesses they rely on.
It's interesting how this need for a consistent wood supply is actually changing the relationship between mills and loggers. It sounds like there's a sense of shared responsibility developing.
There is. We're seeing much more collaboration and partnership between mills and loggers. Sometimes mills are providing financial help to loggers so they can buy new equipment or implement BMPs. They might even loan out equipment like portable bridges to help loggers meet environmental regulations.
It sounds like these challenges are forcing the industry to think more broadly about how all the parts work together.
You got it. That systems thinking is going to be really important going forward, not just for the forest products industry, but for any industry dealing with the effects of climate change.
Okay, so we've talked about how these unpredictable weather patterns are impacting harvesting and how mills are changing their procurement strategies to deal with those disruptions. But what about the wood itself? Is there any concern that the quality or characteristics of the wood might be changing because of climate change?
That's a great question, and it's something researchers are studying. There's some evidence that in certain areas, trees are growing faster because of warmer temperatures and longer growing seasons.
Uh-huh.
And while that might sound good in terms of timber volume, it could also mean changes in the density and strength of the wood.
So it's kind of a two-sided coin. More wood, but maybe not the same quality.
Exactly. And that's something we need to think about carefully as we manage forests and use the wood that's being harvested. It's important to remember that wood is a natural material and it's always reacting to its environment.
It's a reminder that climate change is affecting these systems in ways that we don't always see or understand right away.
For sure. And it shows how important it is to keep doing research and be willing to adapt as we learn more.
You know, we can't talk about the impacts of climate change on the forest products industry without addressing the elephant in the room. Or I guess maybe it's more like the tick in the woods. Lyme disease is a big concern for anyone who works outdoors, and I imagine forest workers are especially vulnerable.
You're right. Lyme disease is a serious threat, and it's something everyone in the industry is very aware of.
It's a human cost of climate change that directly impacts people's livelihoods.
It is. And it's not just the physical risks of Lyme disease, it's the mental and emotional stress it puts on workers who are always worried about getting sick.
What are some things loggers and foresters can do to protect themselves?
Well, the most important thing is awareness. They need to be careful about checking for ticks after being in the woods and wear the right clothes, like long pants and long sleeves, even when it's warm. There are also tick repellents that can help.
Are there any industry-wide initiatives to address Lyme disease, or is it mainly up to individual workers to protect themselves?
There are industry-wide efforts to educate people about Lyme disease and encourage best practices for prevention. Some companies are giving their employees tick removal kits and training them on how to identify and remove ticks correctly. There's also been a push to educate landowners and the public about Lyme disease and how to make their environments safer.
So it sounds like it requires a multi-pronged approach, addressing everything from personal protective measures to habitat management and public education.
That's right. And it's something the industry is taking very seriously.
Earlier, we talked about how climate change is making the spread of invasive species worse, and that can be really harmful to forests. What are some of the species that are becoming more of a problem, and what does that mean for the forest products industry?
We're seeing a lot more invasive plants like buckthorn and knotweed. These plants can crowd out native species, reduce biodiversity, and change entire forest ecosystems. They can also hurt timber quality and make harvesting harder.
Are there effective ways to control these invasive species, or are we fighting a losing battle?
It's a tough fight, but we're not losing. There are different methods, like removing them by hand using herbicides and biological control, which means introducing natural enemies of the invasive species. The key is to catch it early and act fast. The sooner you can spot an infestation and do something about it, the better the chances of containing it.
So just like with tick prevention, it's about being proactive and watchful.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have trained foresters and land managers who can recognize these threats and know how to deal with them effectively.
Speaking of trained foresters, let's shift gears and talk about education and research and how those can help the forest products industry adapt to climate change. Are there specific areas where we need more research or any new skills foresters and loggers will need in the coming years?
There's definitely a need for more research in several areas. We need to better understand how climate change affects forest growth and development and what the long-term effects on timber quality will be. We also need to come up with new silvicultural techniques, which are the methods for managing and caring for forests that are adapted to a changing climate. And we need to find ways to make logging operations more resilient to extreme weather.
So it's not just about reacting to the changes that are happening now. It's about anticipating future challenges and finding solutions.
That's exactly right. And that's where education and training come in. Foresters and loggers are going to have to be more flexible and have a wider range of skills than ever before. They'll need to be comfortable using new technology like GPS and GIS mapping systems, and they'll need to really understand climate science and how it affects the forests they manage.
It sounds like it's an interesting time to be in forestry. Definitely challenging, but interesting.
It is. There are definitely challenges ahead, but there are also some amazing opportunities to come up with new ideas and make a real difference.
We've been talking a lot about the challenges and adaptations happening on the ground, from the forests to the mills, but I'm also curious about the policy side of things. Are there any specific policies or regulations either already in place or being considered that are affecting the forest products industry's ability to adapt to climate change?
That's a crucial question. Policy has a huge impact on how the industry responds to climate change. And there are a couple of areas that are particularly important right now.
I'm all ears. Lay it on me.
One area is incentives for sustainable forest management. Some states and federal agencies are offering financial help or tax breaks to landowners who use practices that help forest health and carbon sequestration. These incentives can help make it more financially viable for landowners to manage their forests in a way that benefits the environment and the timber industry.
It's about aligning economic goals with ecological goals.
Precisely. Another policy area that's getting a lot of attention is carbon markets. These markets allow companies to offset their carbon emissions by investing in projects that take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, things like planting trees or restoring forests. The goal is to create a financial incentive for things that slow down climate change.
That could be a big deal for the forest products industry. If landowners can get paid for the carbon their forests are storing, it creates a whole new source of income and makes sustainable forestry even more attractive.
Absolutely. But there are still lots of questions about how these carbon markets will work in the real world. And there are concerns about making sure the benefits of carbon sequestration are shared fairly and that these markets don't accidentally lead to negative environmental impacts.
It sounds like a pretty complicated situation.
It is, and it's changing all the time. But it's clear that policy is going to be crucial in determining the future of the forest products industry and its ability to adapt to climate change.
This has been such an interesting look at how climate change is affecting the forest products industry and how the industry is finding ways to adapt. So we've spent this episode really digging into how climate change is affecting the forest products industry. But, this deep dive is about more than just trees. We're exploring this because seeing how other industries adapt can teach us valuable lessons for our own careers, no matter what field we're in.
That's so true. What we're really talking about is resilience. The forest products industry is a perfect example of how a whole sector is having to rethink how they do things and find new ways to operate in a changing world. And those are skills that apply to any job.
Absolutely. So for our listeners who might not work in forestry, what are some key takeaways from this deep dive that they can apply to their own professional journeys?
Well, one of the biggest takeaways is the importance of adaptability. We've seen how the forest products industry has had to adapt to everything from changing weather to new regulations. Being able to change course, embrace new approaches, and think on your feet, those are essential skills in today's world.
Yeah, it's about being willing to step outside your comfort zone and challenge the way things have always been done. We saw how loggers are finding alternatives to those traditional frozen roads, and mills are using these spatial menus to track their wood supplies in a more dynamic way.
Yeah.
That kind of creative problem solving is so valuable no matter what you do.
Another key takeaway is the power of collaboration. We've seen how landowners, loggers, and mills are working together more closely than ever to tackle these challenges. They're understanding that their success is tied together, and they're finding ways to support each other.
Those partnerships are crucial. We heard examples of mills helping loggers financially to implement BMPs or even loaning out equipment like portable bridges. That kind of shared responsibility is something we can all learn from regardless of our industry.
We also talked about the importance of thinking long-term. The forest products industry, by its very nature, has to operate on longer timescales. They're planting trees today that won't be harvested for decades.
Right.
And that kind of foresight is so valuable in a world that often focuses on quick wins.
Thinking ahead and anticipating future challenges like the aging workforce, that's something every industry can benefit from. We saw how some mills are already investing in the next generation of loggers because they know their future depends on having skilled workers.
And that leads us to another important takeaway, the value of mentorship and knowledge transfer. We talked about how those traditional winter logging skills are disappearing as reliable winters become less common. That's not just a loss of skills, but a loss of a certain way of understanding the forest. It shows how important it is to pass on those skills and that knowledge to the next generation.
It's about finding ways to connect different generations and make sure valuable expertise isn't lost. And that's relevant in any field. We can all learn from the people who came before us, and we all have a responsibility to share what we know with those coming after us.
And finally, I think one of the most important takeaways from this deep dive is the importance of embracing innovation. We've seen how the forest products industry is finding creative solutions to the problems caused by climate change, from new logging methods to sophisticated procurement strategies. That kind of ingenuity and willingness to try new things is what drives progress in every field.
Yeah, it's about questioning assumptions, being open to new ideas, and not being afraid to experiment.
Exactly. And I think that's a really powerful message to take away from this conversation. Even when faced with big challenges, there's always room for innovation and creativity. And those are the qualities that will help us all succeed in a changing world.
This has been such a fascinating look at how climate change is affecting the forest products industry. We've seen the challenges, the adaptations, and the resilience of this vital industry. But even more importantly, we've learned some valuable insights that can help all of us, no matter our profession, deal with the uncertainties of a changing world and build a more sustainable future.
Thanks for listening.
Hey, this is Steve Bick with the Forest Business School. Thanks for listening to the FBS podcast, and I hope you will subscribe. The truth is, these deep dives barely scratch the surface of some of the topics we cover in the Forest Business School programs, and the podcast is a way of reaching a wider audience. Check out my website at vtfbs.com for more information. Reach out if you want to talk about one of the FBS programs or have custom training or project needs that you'd like to discuss. Again, thanks for listening to the FBS podcast.